Welcome to part 4 of the German Historical Institute Text Mining for Historians course with Dr. Luke Blaxall of the University of Oxford and Dr. Caspar Bielan of the Turing Institute. In this unit, we're going to be looking at basic text analysis with Antconc part 2, using point-and-click software to perform text mining analysis. Antconc, which you can find at the personal webpage of the corpus linguist Lawrence Anthony, lawrenceanthony.net. If you go to software and Antconc, you will find the appropriate version of Antconc to install on your operating system. Antconc is a very small piece of software, just literally a few megabytes. Download it and you are ready to go once you click on it. So when you open Antconc for the first time, this is what it looks like. Now, there are a lot of buttons on Antconc, but the most important ones are these tabs here at the top, which allow you to do things like keyword in context, bigrams, trigrams, collocates, word lists, etc. Now, some of the terms that Antconc uses for things are not exactly the same terms that we've used and other corpus linguists will use. For example, the concordance will show you keyword in context. The clusters will show you bigrams and trigrams. The keyword list is the reference corpus analysis. So that's a little bit confusing, unfortunately, but Lawrence Anthony has chosen to name them in that way. Now, before we begin using Antconc, I just think that there are a couple of sensible options that it's a good idea to press, like setting up all software packages. Now, the first thing, and this is something of a preference, is to treat all data as lowercase. Wherever you can find options that suggest that you treat it as lowercase, I suggest you click on those. Now, the reason for that is simply because it depends on what you're analyzing, but generally speaking, with historical data, it doesn't matter so much if you aggregate terms regardless of whether they're capitalized or not. Now, of course, on some occasions that is going to matter. If you're looking at the term Labour with a capital L, it's probably going to be the Labour Party it refers to in a political text if it's the capital L. If it's a small l, it might refer to industrial relations. So it does depend slightly on the analysis that you're doing, but generally speaking, I think it's easier to treat all text as lowercase. You can always look at the text in context later to make sure you're not aggregating anything that you shouldn't do. Now, the second thing that I'd like you to load up is a stop list. Now, a stop list is something which is useful entirely for word frequency analysis. Stop list is the top 100 or top 150 most common words in the English language and can make some of our word frequency analysis a little bit more meaningful. So if we click here on word list, and then we click use stop list as listed below, I'd then like you to open the stop list. Now, to find the stop list, go from the data folder that we have supplied as part of this course. We're going to be working in this example on the manifestos corpus. Click onto manifestos and then onto Antconc, and then there's the stop list. Now you see the stop list has been populated here. You'll see that it's got lots of very common words on it. Those are the ones that we're stripping off. Now, sometimes those words are very, very interesting if you're a linguist. But generally speaking, historians are more interested in finding these slightly less frequent, but perhaps more meaningful and powerful words in a text, which is why I've loaded the stop list here. But of course, you don't have to use a stop list. It's just more of a quality of life option. So let's click apply. Antconc is now ready for us to use. Now, when you are opening your corpus, as we are about to do on Antconc, a very important thing to be familiar with is that Antconc is all about using lots of different TXT files. And it matters a lot whether you've got one of them open or several of them open, because every corpus file that you have open here in the window of the left will be aggregated by Antconc for your analysis. You can analyze many different corpora at the same time. This is one of the really powerful things that Antconc allows you to do. It is a piece of software that really thrives on chopping, splitting corpora into lots of different constituent groups, loading all up, pushing two together, breaking two apart, etc. This is all very much the way of the world with Antconc. So let's open some files. So once again, going from our data folder, going into the manifestos, going into Antconc, we're going to start by looking at political parties, which we have here, and we're going to open the Labour Party's file. Now this shows all of the Labour Party manifestos from 1966 to the last general election in 2019. And you can open one of those files or as many files as you like. What we're going to do is just open one. We're going to look at the Labour Party manifesto in 1983, which has popped up here. That's all we've got at the moment. Let's start by generating a word frequency list, which is here on the term word list. And simply press start down here. We need to click also, treat all data as lowercase if you want to. Antconc sometimes has a few too many of those boxes there, but let's click it there. There we go. Now, what we've got here is we can see that there are just under 13,000 words in this document. So it's a relatively small, very small corpus to be working with, although still a fairly substantial document. It's actually the longest of the Labour Party manifestos. So the most frequent word, minus all our stop words, remember, is Labour. And you can see some other things, quite a lot of words that mark this out quite clearly as a political text. It doesn't really tell us much on its own, but we can read through them, and if any of the words are interesting and jump out, we can immediately home in on them. And the way we can do this is, for example, let's look at the word major. Okay. Clicking on the word major here, I've then immediately been shown all of the contexts where this appears in this Labour Manifesto of 1983. Talked about major public presence, a major injection of public funds, a major role for the Assembly, etc. Now, we've stumbled here, and Antconc is always very much, these techniques are all very much integrated, and so we will stumble from one technique to the other, although I'll try and make it clear as we go on. That was the word frequency list, of course. And of course, in that word frequency list, you could compare one Labour manifesto to another, look at the order in which some of these words appear in. For example, whether the term programme, for example, might appear in 11th place in this manifesto in 1983, but it might appear in many, many different places in manifestos of other elections. That's part of the interpretation. Now, you can also simply search for words within this manifesto. Now, we've got the word major here. I mean, this is what we've simply clicked across there. You can always click across an Antconc. And we see here that this file here, or this bar, shows you where this word appears in the text. Now, 44 hits in this manifesto, and those little bars that you can see spanning from left to right are where the word appears. Where the black bar is a bit thicker, there's more of a concentration of those words, which is a nice little feature, actually. On concordance, you've got these sentences here. Note that if it is a potentially quite interesting word, and we've simply got the term here major, but if there is an interesting term, like for example the term union, actually not too many different words there, but if we try unions, it might be a bit more. Potentially you can categorize these into different groups manually. The N number here is quite small because I'm only looking at one manifesto. So that just shows you how to basically just search for individual words, any you like, and also off the word list. Now, one concept that I should introduce now is the concept of the lemma. Now, this, which mentioned in the previous lecture, represents a way of trying to aggregate these words. Now, obviously, you'll have seen here that I went just for union, where you've only got in the singular, and we've got some different things here. We've got Soviet Union and trades unions and unions, which was different, but be even quite interesting to use the lemma union. Now, note that you have to be careful with this. You can't simply aggregate, because while we've got union and unions together, we've also got here unionist, which is obviously something completely different. But of course, you can keep checking in context to make sure that you don't aggregate things wrongly. Now, of course, this searching for a lemma with using this asterisk, which is like a wild card, is really useful when you want to search for terms that you really need to aggregate. So, for example, Brit, for example, it makes a lot of sense to aggregate the terms Britain and British and other variations. So if we just search for Brit, we'll see here that 105 mentions of this in this one Labour Party manifesto, and here we've aggregated Britain and British. Now, to move this along, perhaps a little bit more interestingly, let's open all of the Labour Party manifestos from 1966 onwards. Now, just note here, always pay attention to what files are open. You'll see that we just added all of those, and we've actually got the 1983 Labour Party manifesto here twice. So I'm actually going to close one of them. So there we go. If we do a search for this Brit wildcard again, we're going to get scores for every general election, all separately laid out. Very, very helpful. And we can see here variations in the number of times that the term Britain here is used. For example, in February 1974, just 42 times. In the general election of 2001, 134 times. Now, of course, these documents will vary in terms of their word count. And so you can adjust, if you want to, the overall scores to reflect as ratios their different lengths, or you could just simply take the view that the Labour Party manifesto in 1 year is the Labour Party manifesto in 1 year, whether it's short or long, and so it's significant how many times certain words get mentioned. I mean, of course, you can look at hypotheses. So, for example, it seems logical enough to imagine that probably the Labour Party manifestos will include more references to the term women in later manifestos than they will have, for example, in 1966, at a time where the women's liberation movement in Britain was just sort of getting started. So we can try looking at for the word women with the lemma WOM asterisk, so we get woman and women and other variations. Let's have a look and see. So we don't find very many mentions of women at all in the 1966 Labour Party manifesto, just 2, but we do find rather more in 2017. And one would imagine, if one looks at the text, that clump of references there in 2017 is probably going to be in its own section, where a particular, maybe even a section that is dedicated to a particular issue. We can actually have a look here in context. It's talking about the advances for women and around the world and sexual discrimination and so on and so forth. There's clearly a section in the manifesto about that topic. Now, looking then at some other more sort of advanced kind of analyses then. So we've looked at a keyword in context. We've looked at basic kinds of counting. Probably the next thing to look at is bigrams and trigrams. Now, these are simply sets of words that are grouped with each other. Now, if we have a look at the term, for example, a very popular term in political language, the term people. First of all, we just allow this to just have a looking at the numbers. Seems to be increasing over time, interestingly. And when we're looking at bigrams, it's actually under the term clusters. Now, appreciate that that's a different piece of terminology that's being used. Now, at the moment, the software is set up here with cluster size just to look only for bigrams, i.e. common two-word terms that involve people. The most popular is young people. And we have others like British people, working people, etc. If we push this up to 3, we will only get trigrams. These are going to be a lot rarer than bigrams, because combinations of 3 words are obviously more unusual. But we have the British people, people with disabilities, etc. Of course, needless to say, like with all Antconc functions, it's possible to go have a look at young people. Where does it appear in the original text? You know, and then we've clicked on it here, and we can see we've loaded up for young people again here. Young people making a big appearance there in 1983, and you know that terminology then actually reappearing in 2015, but with very, very Spartan use in other kinds of contexts. Another thing you can do, and just going back here to the term people again, going back to keyword in context, is if you again want to group the words, I just did it there via formal bigrams and trigrams, you can click this sort button under the keyword in context here. And there are some additional buttons you can press, but essentially what you're asking the computer to do here is to find words that commonly appear close to the term people. And it's not precise science, this, but Antconc groups them. And so you can then here see, we're talking about people and, it's usually people and their families. It's just a different way of being able to read the corpus, to be able to see some of the linguistic associations, people of low income, people on our streets, etc. There are some ways in which you can change some of the ways this is sorted. This is something called word span. It will look, if you program a higher word span, the software will look, if you have a word span of 5 to the left and the right, the software will look 5 words to the left of a target term, 5 words to the right of a target term. Generally speaking, word spans tend to be between 2 and 5 for corpus linguistics analysis. Now, having shown those things, let's now have a look at collocation analysis. Now, this is a much more challenging analysis to get one's head around. Now, the first thing one needs to do for collocation analysis is that this generally works better if you don't use a stop list, although, of course, you can. So what we can go in here is we can go into the options as we did before and turn off the stop list by clicking on use all words. Now, first of all, what we want to do is get back to our word list. Recalculating that again, as you can see, now we've not got the stop list. Suddenly the term the is the top scoring word, perhaps not too surprisingly. Now, when you do collocation analysis, you have to generate a word list first. This is just how the software uses, because collocation is about finding the relationships between words and other words, it requires you to perform a wordless sort function first. And you will get a little error box, a little nag box that tells you to do that first if you try and do it without. Now, under collocates, what we're trying to do with collocation is we're trying to find, again, words that are attracted to other words. And this is, of course, something really, really important. Now, we're going to use the word people again here, but what we really want to do is just to program our corpus appropriately. Now, we've got here again the word span. I mentioned that just a minute ago. Now, at the moment, it's 1 to the left and 1 to the right. That's very, very limited. I'm going to put that up to 5 to the right and 5 to the 5 to the left. So there's also minimum collocate frequency. Now, it makes a lot of sense unless you want when you are dealing with very small text, sometimes even having a couple of words that is near to a target word is quite significant. But generally speaking, if it's only like one instance of a word or two instances of words, we want to filter them out. So as for the minimum colocate frequency, I'm going to put it up here to 3, bearing in mind that we are not dealing with an enormous text here, only around 200,000 words for all these manifestos combined. If you were dealing with millions of words, minimum colocate frequency, you could push that upwards. You can also do a kind of sorting. Now you can sort by raw frequency of the number of times a word appears within, say, a span of 5 words to the left or right of another word, or you can sort by statistic. Now, statistics of lexical attraction are, there are certain ways these are calculated, but a very popular one is called the mutual information score. And you can actually change the statistic in the tool preferences, although mutual information score, MI, is your default. Right, so let's have a look and try again the lemma with using again my asterisk people and see where we get with our collocates. So what we find here at the top is some words, quite interesting ones. People face, voluntary, opportunities, country. Now, of course, on their own, these aren't that interesting, but what they can be quite useful for are when you compare against other parties. So let's try another one. The word new has appeared on our word list a number of times. I'm not going to bother searching for an asterisk there because I think that the lemma new is unique. So we find some interesting terms here. Like we've got the term Eastern, for example, which is not a term you would necessarily expect compared to something like a word like opportunities. And really, this is where I think some comparative analysis starts to become important. So we've got this data for the Labour Party, we've got the collocates, we've got the word frequency lists, etc. Now, thinking then about the term, the term new, and the kind of top terms that we've got here for the term new. Let's like, for example, just highlight the top 20 here, and then put them in to say an Excel sheet, just so we can record them when we switch from one to another. So here I've put an Excel sheet in here with these Labour words, these Labour collocates of people. And what we're going to do now is we're basically going to do the same thing, but for the Conservatives. So close all the files. And I'm now going to open all of the files for the Conservatives. Going back by party, open here to Conservatives. I'm going to open all of the files for the Conservatives now. Now, of course, we can generate the Conservatives, the Conservative word list, which in and of itself might be quite interesting, where we've not put the stop lists in here, so stop words, so we're going to get quite a lot of similarity. But of course, you could just simply ask yourself the same questions as we already did there for Labour. You could try looking for women across the Conservative manifestos, for example. This is just where the comparison is. It's slightly less focus on women from the Conservatives, probably around 145 mentions compared to around 230 from Labour overall. But we're looking here at the collocates. Now, these are the Labour collocates that are still here. And we did this for the term new. Now, let's do that for the Conservatives. Okay, so some interesting, these are the terms new, for the collocates of new for the Conservatives. So I'm going to copy those and I'm going to put them on a table. And so we can come across here and we've got here the Labour ones on the left in order, the Conservative ones on the right. And sometimes looking at these can be quite interesting. So a combination here of the word strengthen, building, greater. Whereas for the Labour Party, the idea of new homes, for example, new industrial developments, new business, new schools, perhaps there being an emphasis there, we might hypothesize for Labour in terms of building new public infrastructure, whereas the Conservative words not tending to be associated in the same way with those kind of collective nouns, for example. So, some hypotheses really, and if you have some hypotheses that derive from this, one can go and investigate them in all sorts of other ways. So that is the collocation analysis, and some collocations will be a lot more interesting than others will be, but they are all ways of exploring the texts. Right, what we're going to do finally here, as far as a technique is concerned, is we're going to have a look at reference corpus-based comparisons. Now, this is where you get Antconc to automatically compare two corpora against each other to highlight the main words which appear significantly more often in one than the other. Now, this is again another very interesting method of corpus exploration. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to bring in the Liberal Party. And we're going to open here the Liberal Party. And now we're going to program in a reference corpus. Now you should go back into tool preferences for this and go to the keyword list. You'll see here some reference corpus options. And when you choose the files, and because we're going to be comparing in this example, the Liberals to the Labour Party, the other historic centre-left or centre-left progressive party, I'm going to open the Labour Party's corpora as the reference corpus and press apply. So now we've set it up for the Liberals versus Labour. Now, what we need to do to start with here in order to make the keyword list analysis work is to generate a word list for the Liberals. It's generally always a good idea when you open new files to generate a word list. Then we go into keywords, and this is where we get the computer to do the comparison. So here we have them. So note that the term keyness is a statistical metric. This defines the terms that are significantly more common in our Liberal corpus versus Labour. So we get confidence that we've programmed it right because the first two terms are obviously ones that we're going to expect, Liberal and Democrats. And also the term alliance as well, which is something the party was referred to in the between 1981 and 1992. So what are these Liberal terms that are quite interesting, apart from parties that are to do with them? Well, one of them is UK, which seems quite interesting. Well-being, green. Green, well, that's probably a focus here on the environmentalism. Green spaces, green belt. Most of this is modern, as you can see here. So huge emphasis from the Liberal Party here on green issues compared to Labour in the modern period, which is, not something that would necessarily be entirely intuitive. Proportional, well, probably proportional representation, one tends to think. Yes, always a favourite Liberal Democrat issue there. Term mental, interesting here. Presumably going to be about mental health and mental illness. Almost certainly a strong skew towards modern times here. That's true. One instance of mental illness there in 1974, but the Liberal Democrats talking about mental health much more than the Labour Party. And there are a lot of very interesting potential triggers here. European, perhaps again, not a surprise, generally a traditional European issue. The term federal, a very interesting one there, to do with local government. So some really interesting potential terms here. Now, what we can also do with the reference corpora is we can swap them round. So what we've done now is we've now got the Labour Party's corpora here versus the Liberal Party as the reference corpus. Next, let's do a keyword list again. Sorry, a word frequency list. So we've done that. And now let's go on to the keywords. So the most powerful Labour word relative to Liberals is Labour, unsurprisingly. Now, here the term will. Now, this is probably one of these terms that will be stripped out by our stop list. But I wonder why Labour Party using this very, very common word will so much more often and we than the Liberals. I would venture to suggest this is because the Labour Party is, of course, one of the principal parties in British politics, which can potentially obviously win general elections and can talk in terms of what it will do, like with a Labour government will implement the proposals, it says in 1979, not really something that the Liberal Party are able to say as a third party. Find here, looking at some other terms here, the term Tories and Tory. Now, this is quite interesting. This is obviously a term for the Conservative Party. The term Tory generally being a slightly pejorative kind of word, but it's not a word that the Liberals tend to use about the Conservative Party. It's one that the Labour Party tend to use much more often than the Liberals do, which in and of itself is quite interesting. So many other terms here which are potentially interesting, like the term million, for example, that again might be relate to potential numbers of people, to spending decisions, etc. Maybe again more things that a party of government is likely to use. But the point here, though, without getting too much into this in depth, looking at these terms can be very useful for a sort of initial textual reconnaissance. Trying to find the really distinct and interesting words that we would perhaps not necessarily think of. And then, of course, we can look at, the term Tories, for example, in context and look at here where they appear in the Labour corpus. And so potentially we can maybe categorize these, or just simply read about them in the core text, because these are terms that the Labour Party using that the other anti-Conservative party, the Liberals, are not really using. So that is the basic introduction to the techniques. Now, of course, in terms of your analysis and how you can actually use these to analyze things rather than just explore, that is, of course, something that is a great deal more challenging in of itself. Is it a question that simple word counts are interesting? Are you going to list common bigrams or trigrams? Are you going to look at the mutual information score, to look at collocation strength, for example, to look at, for example, when political parties mention government, when they mention the people, what do they mean when they mention those terms? Finding words that are commonly associated with those across the different political parties gives you an idea, not just of how often the parties mention the people, but also what they mean by the people, for example. And it can obviously be the case that many of these analyses can be integrated with close reading analysis. And as you can see within the text, it's always possible, or you're always encouraged to stay very much anchored within the text, to be able to click from one score to the next to ensure that this doesn't simply become an exercise in detached quantification. So those are the main ways in which you can use Antconc. As I say, the interpretations of the results, whether you use percentages, whether you weight your results by the size of the corpus. As I say, these manifestos are all different lengths, for example. How you actually use the statistical data to make arguments, that's going to be something we're going to be dealing much more with in the second of our courses about statistics.